The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the trigger bar plunger with its spring and its retention end into the channel in the frame. If it's not staying assembled like that, you'll have to do it in pieces. Mine's staying together. So we're going to slide that into the groove in the channel that it belongs in there. Just push that in. You can see it's under pressure if you push on it. Next, let's take the slide stop spring, which has the curved front end that drops in and locks into that retention piece. And so we're going to set that down in its channel. There's a very specific channel that you can see on the frame, and there's a hole in the front, which is where that piece drops into. Let's go ahead and put a little pressure on that detent to make sure it's not prematurely catching something. Set that in place. Let's go ahead and put pressure the rest of the way until you feel or see this top spring come down and rest in the detent. Basically, I'm just pushing on that until that top spring drops into place. Now the slide stop spring is holding the plunger retention in place. Next, we want to take the pin that holds that spring down. It's got a sharp end to it. You can see that. It's got one sharp side to it when the sharp end goes first, and then there's a little bit of a detent in the middle of it, and that's going to catch on that spring. And we want to take a look and make sure that we're getting on top of the spring. If you're at all unsure, get out your glasses and make sure you're lining it up, but usually you can see it. In fact, I should have my glasses on and I don't. So we're going to make sure that's going over the top of the spring, and then this gets driven in with a hammer or a punch. I find mine's not too much pressure, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drive that in there, and you can feel it go in, and then push it in, and then you want to feel that it clicks. So let's take a little bit of a punch here, and you can try it with your hands pressure, or go ahead and tap it one more time with the mallet, and you'll feel it and hear it click into place. And if you've got some strong glasses and lights, you can see it that it's in the groove. So now the slide stop spring is being retained. So next, let's put the extractor and spring in place. Real quick note here, the extractor is going to go forward. The spring is going to go in the pin that goes through it, and it's going to ride in the middle in the hammer strut channel, and this spring is going to hook on to, well, you can see that, onto that lever, and then the dog leg is going to go down the back of the mainspring channel. But we're going to leave that unhooked first, and we're going to get this all in place, and then we'll hook it with some tweezers. And we'll pull that in place. So let's get that in place. Let's get it started. There's only one pin that fits it, and we'll get that started in place going through the frame. Let's get that into the channel, not all the way, and then we're going to take and we'll get some tweezers here. Got some locking tweezers, and we're going to set that down, the dog leg straight down the channel until we get in line with the pin, and we're going to let the pin catch that and put it in place. There we go. And make sure everything's flush. Now let's take with your tweezers or a screwdriver, and let's manipulate that right hook on that spring until it's in place on the extractor. And we know we've got that in place when you can see it coming out the other side of the extractor. Next, let's take our hammer and our pivot pin, and let's put that in place. The hammer needs to go in before the sear because it has to come to the front and pull back. So let's pull that extractor out of the way a little bit to make clearance for that, and we'll get that lined up with its hole here. And we'll take the hammer pivot pin, get that in place until it drops in. Hammer pivot pin fits in a little groove there, but note that this is loose. You may want to put a piece of tape over it so it doesn't keep falling out on you for the rest of the process. Next, let's put the trigger bar and the trigger in place and get it seated under the plunger. In order to do that, the first thing I want to do is I want to insert the slide stop, because this is a little bit of a booger. That spring is actually quite strong on this one. And what I do, I'll just keep that aimed down so I don't scratch the frame. Easiest thing for me seems to be to put a pin through on the right hand side and kind of pry that spring out of the way a little bit. And then I want to get the slide stop started. I want to go gentle here because I don't want it to go too far, and I just want it to start. I don't want it to engage with the spring because then it'll be sticking out too far. All right, so we'll just leave that aimed down. Next, we're going to take the trigger bar, and we're going to pull the extractor forward, and then slide that in between the frame there, underneath, and you'll feel it hit the hammer. Move that hammer forward. You know you have it in the right place. You can let go of the extractor. Let's take our trigger, line that up on its pin, and then we're going to drop that down in its groove, making sure that stays aligned. And then the trick here is to get all of this tucked in behind that plunger, which doesn't want to cooperate with you because it needs that pressure to work properly. And so a few times I use metal on metal, but I'll get that underneath. I'll put pressure here on this pivot point, down and back, and I'll get a small jeweler screwdriver tucked in between there, and I'll pull that plunger forward until it snaps in place. Hard to do that on camera while I'm talking, but let me see if I can do this real quick here. There. And then once that's down, keep pressure on that, manipulate your trigger a little, and you'll feel it pull it the rest of the way down. With that pulling down, you can go ahead and insert your slide stop until it clicks, and then that'll help hold it in place. And now you can see that things are starting to function. So next we're going to put our blocker bar in place. So let's take that, making sure we've got the arm to the right and up. We've got a little bit of a dog leg on the back that has to tuck in under the frame. So let's move the transfer bar forward, get that tucked into place. It's actually easier, if you get the pin started. So let's begin the pin from the left side because it's got a little bit of a spring pressure from the trigger bar there. We'll get that slightly sticking into the frame here so we can feel it. And then we'll get this manipulated behind the extractor, behind the ejector, and lined up, and then should be able to work that directly into place. That one actually goes in quite easy. That's the easy one. Okay, so next we're going to put the sear in place, and that takes a little more manipulation. So we're going to do it first without the spring, and we're going to put the pin in place without the spring. You can drive it from either side. Let's go ahead and get that started again through the frame. Make sure that's not sticking out. Let's pull the ejector forward out of the way, and what the key is you've got to get this little knob on the back to engage with that finger of the ejector that I showed you earlier. That has to ride together. So we've got to get that rested together. The right side of the sear fitted under the blocker bar, the left side over the top of the blocker bar, and all that while figuring out how to get that pin in place just right and started through the sear. And this time it's working pretty well for me. And now we actually have our sear engaged, we just do not have the spring in place yet. So next we're going to take our sear spring. We're going to want to make sure we orient that right. Again, you're going to have the bent part aim at the top across the blocker bar, and then the straight down dog leg is going to fit inside that groove in the front of the sear. So in order to get this done, what we want to do is take a couple pins here, and we want to start to work the sear pin back out, but make sure it retains the sear. I'm going to push in from one side, pull back, give myself room to hold that spring, keeping things at an angle here so nothing gets loose. Then I'm going to take this spring, and I'm going to get that dog leg down in front of the sear properly, and if I get that done, the top of the spring is going to lay right across the top of the blocker bar. I may not get this all on camera, but essentially from here I'm going to be putting down and back pressure and working that pin in until I've captured the spring. Take a couple tries there, a little bit of a manipulation with the ejector here because that does need to ride together, and because there's so many up and down moving parts there, that's probably one of the trickiest parts of putting this gun back together. If you get that done, great. If not, just go back and try again. It's not impossible. It actually does come together. Okay, so next let's get some pressure here on the mainspring so we can take the Scotch tape off. So in order to do that, let's take our hammer strut, slide that in, of course bent to the back. We're going to catch a roll pin up in the hammer there. It catches it pretty naturally on this gun, and most guns I've taken apart, I really don't have a problem with that. It seems to be a pretty natural channel. They designed these to do that. You want to make sure the spring goes over the top of the strut, and then you want to catch the cap and make sure that captures the spring properly. If If your hammer's forward, you're going to have a lot less pressure. I don't even know if you could get it on if it's backwards. This particular one, the lanyard, has a slot on it. If you get it in backwards, you'll know because it doesn't line up right. This particular one goes down to the right. In order to get the pin in the easiest, I find that if I, again, just like when I took it off, I put it down on the table, put downward pressure while I'm sliding the pin into the hole, and you'll feel it when it hits the hole. You may have to manipulate a little bit to the right or the left to get the pin into place. Hard to show that on camera, but you'll know it's in place because your pin's flush. And there you have it. Now we can remove the tape because that pivot pin has pressure now. And you should be able to check all your mechanisms to make sure that they work. Everything should be in good working order now. The only thing we have left to do is reassemble the gun, put the grips on, put the slide back on, function test it, and we should be good to go. All put back together. Check all your pins, make sure they're aligned well, nothing came loose. Sometimes when you're moving things around, you'll find that they're misaligned just a little bit. Make sure they're flush where they should be. Once you get the grips and the slide in place, it will hold everything. Now let's reassemble the slide. We'll start with the slide itself and the firing pin. The firing pin has a notch on the top of it, and it has a bump out on the right-hand side. And this, again, is on particular on the P89 manual safety model. On the decocker model, I believe that bump out is actually on the left side. It's a little bit different mechanism if you're working with the decocker model. But on the manual safety model, that's the way it's oriented. So let's put the firing pin into place. Let's drop that in. If you have a little bit of resistance, it could be coming from the plunger that is still retained in the slide, which is under the rear sight. And so we want to take and we want to put pressure downward on the firing pin, push in on that plunger if you need to, and let's get it down pretty far in there. Then let's take our right hand safety. You can tell that by the holes that are in it. And we're going to aim that straight down, pointed to the bottom of the pistol, bottom of the grip if it were there, until it locks into place. You can see the groove that it can ride on. And when that's in place, you can let up on the firing pin, and then that safety will actually hold the firing pin in place. And you can see that that's working well. Let's go ahead and put it all the way up into the firing position. Now we can put the right hand side safety in there, and you'll be able to look through the hole and see exactly where that aligns. There's a groove on the top that will line up to. Okay, and let's put that in straight in. You'll feel it go into a certain point, and the resistance you're feeling is because of that little detent plunger on the bottom. So let's simply take a tool, push that in, or your fingernail if you can do it, and let's push that in while we're putting pressure in on the right hand side of the safety. And that should work perfectly. The only thing left to do is put the extractor in place and then reassemble, reverse the field stripping. The extractor on this particular model can go straight in, lay in. Some models have a little piece of metal right here and you have to get it up and under. So this particular one, we're going to take that end and push it back in towards that safety. And then we need to get pressure out and back on the extractor itself to get it locked into place. I find a simple way to do that with a little bit of leverage. Again, I like using plastic, and so I'll pull that backwards, a little more pressure I can get there, and we'll pull out and back. And you just have to work it a little bit because it's working its way around the slide components to get that lever in place. And when you feel it click in place, you know that it's working. Now it's locked in place. Check your safety, you know it's done. We'll simply reinsert the barrel, the guide rod and spring back in place, and then you have a reassembled slide. Okay, so with your frame reassembled, your slide reassembled, let's go ahead and put it back together again. Let's make sure that the ejector is in the down position. Take the slide, slide it back over the frame. Go back until the half moon hole lines up. Go carefully so you don't get what we call the idiot mark. Make sure that line's in there just right. Similar to putting together a 1911. When that snaps in place, you know you're there. Let's function test this thing. We can put a magazine in there, an empty one of course. Function test it. It holds the slide open. Release. Fully detailed, stripped, fully reassembled. Ruger P89. Hope you enjoyed it. Drop me a comment below. Give me a thumbs up. I hope this helped a lot.